Hello. Tonight, we're stepping away from tales of royalty and grandeur to explore the margins of history, the parts often forgotten. We're focusing on medieval peasants, those who never wore crowns or rode horses, who endured illness, famine, cold, and countless small hardships. They held no titles, earned no recognition, and left behind little more than stories whispered through time. Their days were long, their nights brief, and their strength quiet but unyielding, stronger than many of us could manage. If this gentle, unhurried glimpse into the past helps you relax, feel free to show your support. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same quiet narrative. Now lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. Get comfortable, and let's begin on the fringe of the known world. This village has no name, or if it did, it's long forgotten. Nestled in a shallow valley somewhere in the vague expanse of nowhere, it folds quietly into the landscape. It's far from roads, unnoticed in records and beneath the notice of rulers. You wouldn't find it on a map, even if you had one, which you don't. You've never even seen a map. Here, the world ends where the forest begins. The trees move slowly, ancient and indifferent to your presence. The fields stretch out in crooked swaths of green and brown, worked to exhaustion and beyond. To the north, they say, there's a river. You've never seen it, only heard of it in the same tone as one might speak of saints or myths. You were born here, and you'll die here, likely within a few dozen steps of both moments. The homes are rough, leaning from too many winters of wind. The walls are made of mud, straw, and sticks, woven, patched, and repaired with whatever nature hasn't claimed yet. The roofs sag with age, always dripping where you can't reach to fix. The air smells of smoke, wet wool, earth, and livestock, tinged with the must of dampness and decay. It's the scent of life here. The path in isn't really a road, just muddy ruts worn by ox carts filled with water and buzzing with insects. No one notable travels it. Maybe no one ever has. Life here moves quietly. If the wind carries it, a distant bell from another village might mark the hours. Otherwise, time is measured by sun, shadow, or the ache in your back. A dozen families live here, enough to gather on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's troubles, but they're left alone until they can't be. The closest thing to a leader is a man named Tom. He once spoke to a monk and repeats that story often, as though it grants him wisdom. No one challenges him. His home still stands. His goat is healthy. That's leadership enough. There are no written records, no property lines beyond vague landmarks like past the old elm or where the ground gets soft. Disputes are settled with a shrug, a brief argument, maybe a shared loaf of bread. There's no school, tavern, or inn. When someone new appears, it's the talk of the village for weeks. Who are they? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell of the sea? Strangers are rare and unsettling, and no one leaves, not truly. Travel is more a rumor than a possibility. You've heard stories of towns with buildings tall as trees, but they're as real to you as talking animals or women who become birds. You don't miss what you've never known. The forest is deep, the hills are long, the roads, if they exist, are known for danger, not destination. Even if you went, where would you go? You don't speak other tongues. You have no money. You don't know the rules of other places. You don't even know your own age. So, you stay. It's hard. It's dull. The roof leaks. The well runs low. The stew's been the same for days. But there's comfort in the familiar, in knowing where the firewood is, who to ask for help, and what part of the sky means it's time to bring in the animals. You rise with the sun, you sleep when it sets. You work in between. It isn't grand, but it's life. And in its quiet, steady rhythm, something endures. There's a kind of quiet contentment here, one that doesn't question much or seek to understand anything beyond what can be seen from the nearby hilltop. Occasionally, you might hear word of a distant war, a ruler's death, or a celestial event that frightened a far-off village, but such reports arrive as rumors, too diluted by retellings to carry real weight. Time itself feels different. Seasons don't arrive in neat succession, they blend together. Spring's dampness becomes summer's rain, and frost slowly hardens into a winter that wears through your boots. Years aren't counted, harvests are. Wet ones, dry ones, the failed one when the rye spoiled, and the good one when the barley grew thick enough to make even old Margery smile for days. An official comes now and then, tallies grain, asks questions, takes notes. You respond with care, keeping things vague. He doesn't seem to want details. You've never seen the ruler. You're not quite sure what his role is, but you know his name and speak it in your prayers, just in case. Out here, little changes, and when it does, it's often for the worse. But the fire burns, the roof mostly holds, and the cottage stays warm. Tomorrow the sun will rise over the same hills, and that's enough. In your life, you'll cover hundreds of miles, most of them in circles. Few venture far from where they were born, not due to a lack of curiosity or endurance, though proper boots are rare, but because the world beyond the hills doesn't feel like it's yours. The idea of exploring it is as distant as flying. You grow up learning every field, every stump on the way to the well, every footprint on the road. Beyond that, things become abstract. The next village may be 5 miles off, but it feels like another world. You've heard the stories, who married whom, who stole a goat, who dozed through mass. But you've never seen the place and likely won't. Travel isn't adventurous. It's hard, risky, and exhausting. Paths aren't marked or paved. They're muddy, winding tracks through forests and fields. There are no maps, just directions like turn at the leaning tree or left past the rock shaped like a sleeping pig. On the road, dangers lurk. Forests are dense and ominous, full of noises you can't name, boars, wolves, or people who don't want company. Then there are bandits, desperate souls with nothing to lose. Travelers, especially well-fed ones, attract the wrong kind of attention. A woman alone might be assumed to have something valuable. Confidence won't protect you. Getting lost isn't just inconvenient, it can be fatal. With no one to come looking, you could vanish entirely, only noticed, missing after a holiday when someone shrugs at your absence. Then there's the matter of responsibility. Who tends your land while you're gone? Who feeds the animals? What if someone comes collecting taxes in your absence? You can't explain your curiosity to someone keeping records. And if you did arrive elsewhere, what then? You're not expected, you're not wanted. Strangers bring trouble, sickness, crime, odd customs. Even your speech or the way you hold a spoon might mark you as an outsider. Hospitality isn't guaranteed. Food is limited, beds already taken. Home might not be truly safe, but it's known. You know which part of the roof leaks, which hens roam too far, which neighbor might help in a pinch. Still, some people do travel, not usually farmers, but traders, monks, or messengers, those with a reason, or protection, or both. You might catch sight of them once or twice a year. They arrived with carts loaded with wool or preserved fish, bringing tales with them like smoke lingering from a fire. They spoke of far-off cities where stone buildings lined streets filled with spice cellars and paved roads that stayed firm even in the rain. It all seemed too fantastic to be real. You listened, but didn't let yourself believe too deeply. Even if such places did exist, what could you possibly do there? You couldn't read, had no money, and didn't know the customs. A city like that could consume you without a trace. So you remained, not only out of fear, though fear sometimes played a part, but because there were duties to fulfill, fences to fix, a niece to watch over, barley to dry, and countless other chores that needed attention before sunset. And because, truthfully, the world didn't have to be any larger than what you already knew. The village had everything: gossip, arguments, changing weather, illness, fleeting moments of happiness. It had the sound of bells marking time, the slow dance of the seasons, and the quiet satisfaction of making it through each day. Sometimes you wondered about what lay beyond the forest, but most days your concern was more immediate, like not letting the stew burn while fetching water. Some did leave, usually those driven by desperation, boldness, or ambition. A young man might leave chasing work, adventure, or a cause. He might return with a limp or a tail or not at all. When someone didn't come back, people just nodded and said he went past the trees, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was narrow, but it was familiar. You weren't lonely exactly. You shared your time with family, neighbors, animals, and the land. Repetition brought comfort. Familiar grumblings felt like home. You didn't need to see far-off cities to know the worth of warmth, or taste cinnamon to appreciate sweet bread, or cross borders to feel love, sadness, boredom, or hope. As the years passed, as aches grew and children outgrew the fence posts, the idea of leaving faded, not with regret, but with clarity. Some are made to wander, you were made to remain. There's no design, no grand plan, no tidy pile of labeled materials waiting to be assembled, just soil, timber, and whatever else nature hasn't already claimed. Your home isn't a house in the usual sense. It's more a negotiation between shelter and the elements, between your effort and what the land grudgingly allows. You start with a frame, rough timbers hewn from nearby trees, cut with tools passed down for generations. The wood bends, twists, it isn't straight, and neither are your walls. Once the frame stands, you weave branches or pliable sticks between the supports in a technique called wattle. It's not graceful or fast, but it holds much like your life. Then comes the daub, a mixture of mud, straw, dung, and water. You apply it by hand, press it into gaps, smooth it just enough to keep out the wind, pretending you meant it to look that way. It dries slowly, cracks in the sun, sometimes crumbles, and needs redoing before winter. You grow used to the smell and eventually stop noticing it. The roof is thatch, dried straw packed and tied to the beams. Fresh, it shines golden and almost beautiful. Then the rains arrive, then the birds, then time. The color dulls, the edges fray, holes form in unexpected places. You start placing buckets beneath the leaks. You don't seal it or shingle it. You just keep patching until it's more patch than roof. At some point, you wonder if sleeping under a cart might be simpler. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's firm, and mostly it is. Years of walking and sweeping and spilling have compacted it into something nearly solid. But when it rains, it softens again. When it freezes, it cracks. When the goats come in at night, you're never sure what's underfoot. You might lay straw or rushes to help. It works for a while. Then the straw gets damp, gets filthy, gets ground to dust. You sweep it out and start again, or you don't. Eventually the straw becomes part of the floor, part of the land. The walls have openings usually covered by wooden shutters that never quite fit right. Glass is too costly, too uncommon, and too fragile to be practical. As a result, the wind flows through along with the cold, the sounds of animals outside, and occasionally the animals themselves. There's a single door, often slightly askew, due to shifts in the frame from the last frost. It's secured with a hook or a wooden peg, not to keep out thieves, since there's little to steal, but to stop the wind from entering and the chickens from leaving. Inside, the space is shared. One room, maybe two, if someone managed to build on a lean-to or loft, but typically just one space for sleeping, eating, cooking, mending, talking, arguing, and hoping. It houses everyone: parents, children, a cousin, a grandparent, or even a neighbor's child whose own parents are ill or absent. In the center, there's a hearth, stone if fortune favored you, clay if not. Smoke escapes through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney. The air inside is always a bit smoky, slightly warm, a little damp, and carries the lingering scent of stew, reheated many times. Furnishings are sparse: a table, a bench, a stool, maybe a carved chest if someone in the family had talent or married well. Beds are simple wooden frames filled with straw or feathers, shared and often creaky. Blankets are thick, coarse wool, heavy and seldom dry. Storage exists in the rafters: garlic, onions, herbs, perhaps a small ham if luck had smiled that year. The air overhead tells you whether it's early winter or late spring, sometimes reassuring, sometimes a stark reminder of dwindling supplies. Animals live alongside the people: a cow in the corner, chickens roaming, a goat perhaps. It's not clean, but it's warm. You get used to the sounds: clucking, shuffling, a sudden bleat, just as you do the rustle of the thatch or the groaning of the walls. The floor is uneven, the roof slants, the walls bulge, as if the structure breathes with the seasons. You repair what you can, ignore what you can't. Every spring brings a vow to fix the leaning wall. Every autumn, it still leans. This isn't a house built to endure. It's built to survive the next storm. And yet, despite its flaws, it is home. You know where the cold seeps in and how to block it. You know which beam to hang the pot from and which creaks under pressure. You know how the sunlight filters in during the afternoon and where the dog prefers to sleep. To outsiders, it may look like poverty. To you, it's ingenuity, persistence, and resilience. A roof still intact is a triumph. A fire that lasts the night is a gift. A dry corner feels priceless when you lie down, surrounded by snores, silence, smoke, and straw. There's a strange comfort. Not quite pride, but presence. This is your space. It bends and creaks and leaks, but it holds. And so do you. For the typical peasant, food wasn't about taste or variety. It wasn't colorful or indulgent. It was a daily challenge. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was just a corner near the hearth. There were no pantries or neat shelves of ingredients, no sunlit herbs hanging to dry, just a pot, a fire, and whatever hadn't spoiled. At the heart of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of continuous stew that simmered day and night. It was never truly fresh, never truly finished. New ingredients were added, old ones eaten away. It stayed warm through the seasons, and you hoped nothing unpleasant began growing in it. What went into it depended on what was available, which often wasn't much. On a good day, it might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and some legumes, maybe garlic or onions if the season allowed. In winter, dried peas or beans filled the pot. If fortune smiled, a scrap of salted pork might be added. More often, it was just the bone, which still held value. One bone could be boiled for days, coaxing out any remaining flavor. The taste was always the same, earthy, grey, more about warmth than flavor. You didn't eat pottage for enjoyment. You ate it because it was what there was. A warm bowl at the end of the day meant you'd made it through. The day offered more than just sustenance. It felt like a small triumph. The cooking pot was never truly clean. It was wiped, occasionally scraped, but seldom scrubbed. Each new meal carried remnants of the last. No strong flavors masked it, no spice, no vinegar. Only a slow, familiar blandness, a flavor steeped in repetition. Bread played a central role, but it wasn't soft or inviting. It was coarse, dense, and dark, often made from rye, barley, or oats. The fine white wheat flour was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. For common folk, even seeing it was rare. Their bread was compact and crumbly, staling quickly. Left out for a day, it could serve as a blunt instrument, but it was filling and ideal for dipping in stew. At times, it was made from questionable materials, flour husks, chaff, ground peas, or remnants from the mill. In dire times, even tree bark was used, not as metaphor, but literally. The inner bark was ground and mixed with flour to create famine bread, bitter, tough, and barely edible, yet it sustained life. On the worst days, people used old bread as plates called trenchers, which soaked up the stew, and were either eaten at the end or fed to animals, sometimes handed down to those of lower rank, an edible symbol of social order. Meat was scarce. Chickens were kept for eggs, cows for milk. Livestock were only slaughtered out of necessity, and every part was used: meat, fat, organs, bones, even blood. Pork was the most accessible meat, with pigs valued for their efficiency. Their preserved fat could elevate an otherwise bland dish. But a pig slaughter was an event requiring weeks of preparation and preservation. Fishing, though available to some, was limited by ownership of water sources. Unauthorized fishing could be punished. When fish were caught, they were often small or preserved, like salted herring, which was highly valued. Dietary rules from religious authorities shaped meals as well. Meat was off limits on certain days, prompting reliance on fish or creative loopholes, such as classifying beaver tails as aquatic fare. Milk was common but perishable, needing swift consumption or conversion into cheese or butter. Butter was considered a delicacy, used in moderation. Cheese was sharp, dry, and durable, a sign of a productive cow. Despite their utility, dairy products often upset digestion, and with no refrigeration, spoilage was common. Sour milk was still used, spoiled butter tolerated, moldy cheese salvaged by trimming. Beverages were basic, water was unreliable, sometimes unsafe. Ale became the standard, weak, homemade, and consumed by all ages. It had low alcohol content, just enough to purify and quench. Cider was an option if fruit was available. Wine was reserved for elites. Mead was uncommon. Milk was for children or the ill. For most, every meal came with ale, easing the monotony of an unchanging diet. Vegetables made up the bulk of nourishment: cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, and older varieties of carrots in shades of white or purple. These were grown in small plots, utilized completely. Even greens and peels had purpose, cooked or burned. Fruits were seasonal, mostly apples, and some berries or wild plums. If dried, they could last through the colder months. Preservation was hard. Sugar was nearly unobtainable. Honey, if it was available, was a rare treat. Meals remained savory, though that word was used generously. Herbs like parsley, sage, dill, and mint were grown more for health or ritual than taste. Any improvement in flavor was incidental. Meals were shared around the hearth on benches. There were no courses, no formal recipes, just a pot, a piece of bread, and the hope of another meal tomorrow. Complaints changed nothing. A feast, if one occurred, was for a wedding, a harvest, or a sacred day. Sacred cook a bird, or prepare a pie, not the delicate, flaky kind known today, but a dense, sealed container of hard dough packed with meat. If available, spices like pepper, ginger, or cinnamon were used, though they were rare. A good trade might bring in some flavor, but most days weren't celebrations, they were routine. You finished what was in your bowl, dipped bread to catch the last of it, drank ale, and leaned back, not fully content, but full enough. There was a kind of comfort in the repetition, knowing the taste of the stew, the amount of bread left, the familiar hands cooking over the same fire. As the wind slipped through the wall cracks and animals shifted in sleep, the stew simmered, the bread cooled, and again you had just enough. As a peasant in the medieval era, possessions were minimal, perhaps a bit of land, some tools, a few animals, and a crooked house you built yourself, but none of it truly belonged to you. It all belonged to the local lord, not royalty, not someone distant, but a nearby landowner who lived up the hill in a sturdier home with better food and fewer leaks. Owning the land meant owning what was on it, including you, in a way. You were a villain, not an insult, but a social rank. You worked the land but didn't own it. You were tied to it, unable to leave without permission or pass it on freely. You owed labor, goods, and respect, not enslaved but not entirely free. Your interactions with the Lord were minimal. Communication ran through the steward, the man who oversaw the land and tracked what each person owed, and you owed plenty. Labor came first, a few days weekly, more during harvest, working the Lord's fields without compensation. This was known as corvée labor. There was no reward beyond knowing someone in the manor ate because of your work. Taxes came in many forms, part of your grain, wool, chickens, eggs. Brew ale, you owed some, owned a pig, expect to give bacon, catch fish. The river wasn't yours. Even grinding grain cost you, since using the Lord's mill came with a fee, and trying to do it by hand was illegal and punishable. The Lord didn't just want resources, he wanted control. The same applied to baking. Many manors had communal ovens that required payment. Baking privately could bring penalties. You learned to do things the official way, no matter the cost or logic. Fees were constant. Want to marry? Pay. Inherit land? Pay. Move? Ask permission? Then pay. Livestock and tools were taxed. Even your right to have children wasn't entirely free from oversight. In return, the Lord was supposed to offer protection. If danger came, bandits or invading nobles, he had armed men. During famine, he might distribute grain, though rarely without a price. Legal issues, like disputes over livestock, might be settled by his court for a fee. This was feudalism, a hierarchy of obligations and control masked as loyalty and protection. In practice, it was about ownership. Land was power. Those who held it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor stood apart from the village, often literally higher, built from stone or timber, larger and sturdier than any peasant's dwelling. Inside were tapestries, servants, tables, and the Lord himself, dressed in wool lined with fur, eating meals unimaginable to you, likely unaware of your name, but familiar with your dues, how much barley you owed, how many eggs were promised, whether your son was old enough for labor. Records were kept, not by you, as you couldn't read, but by stewards, reeves, bailiffs, men with wax tablets or parchment who asked questions you learned to answer cautiously. Failure to meet your obligations brought punishment, often more goods taken or additional days of labor, your labor. In the worst situations, your tools could be taken, your land reclaimed, your home and livestock gone, along with your pride. There was no defiance. To resist wasn't rebellion, it was foolishness. And yet, strangely, the system held, not because it was just, but because it was consistent, harsh, but predictable. You knew what you owed, what was required. No uncertainty, no abrupt changes, just a relentless cycle of giving. And once in a while, there was something in return, a feast where food was shared, a break from labor, a kind word from a figure on horseback. Not enough to make things equal, but just enough to prevent collapse. It was never a warm relationship, but it endured. Whether your master was young or old, cruel or kind, near or absent, he remained above you. That wasn't questioned. You showed respect, not because it was earned, but to avoid trouble. Maybe also because somewhere inside you hoped you might be seen, acknowledged, lifted, even slightly. It almost never happened, but that faint hope helped keep the system going. Not only fear, but the belief, however faint, that enough obedience, hard work, and prayer might change something, might change. Meanwhile, the steward walked, the reeve recorded, the mill turned, and your hands dug into the earth, season after season, year after year. No promotions, no bonuses, no retirement. Only the quiet recognition that you had done your part. You survived another year beneath someone else's authority, and as long as they were content, you were allowed to keep living. Long before any major pandemic swept across the continent, people already lived side by side with illness. Not just the seasonal kinds, though those were common, but a constant undercurrent of things that could go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting, swelling, coughing. Disease wasn't an anomaly, it was a constant. You didn't need a disaster to fall ill. A small wound, a flea bite, or water that looked clean but wasn't could be enough. And unlike taxes or the weather, disease had no rules. It struck without warning and rarely left quietly. Hospitals, as we understand them, didn't exist. If fortune smiled, your village had a healer, perhaps a midwife or herbalist, maybe even a monk, literate and kind, who might offer better care than prayer alone. But usually you stayed home. You sweated it out, hoping for the best. People didn't know what caused sickness. The word germ didn't exist. Microscopes were far in the future. All they had were old and often wrong theories. One idea was miasma, bad air that carried illness through smell. If a village reeked of rot and smoke, it was assumed to be dangerous. In a sense, that was true, but not in the way they thought. To fight it, people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers, or pressed vinegar-soaked rags to their faces. Ineffective, but believed. Others thought illness was punishment for sin, impure thoughts, bad deeds, or moral failure. If your child got sick or your crops died and your body followed, it was blamed on you or maybe your neighbor. Other local ideas blamed the evil eye, moon phases, spirits, or moody saints. One common belief was that sickness entered through the feet, so they boiled them. If that failed, they might burn the bedding. The treatments were as odd as the causes. A fever might call for bloodletting. A man would show up with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than skill. Leeches, stones, or other tools might be used to balance the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. No one had seen these, but they were blamed for almost everything. For swelling, you might use poultices made from mashed herbs, mud, or even bread tied to the skin. Some helped, many didn't, a few made things worse. But doing something felt necessary. For stomach aches, charcoal might be chewed. For bloody coughs, crushed pearls in wine. For blurry vision, smoke and whispered prayers. If your leg blackened, there were likely no options left. Then there were the charms, small items believed to guard against plague. A piece of metal or bone worn at the neck, sometimes marked with protective phrases or blessed by a spiritual figure. Some buried onions in the corners of their homes, while others hung garlic over doorways. One widely used method involved tying a live chicken to the infected area in the hope that the illness would pass to the animal. It seldom worked, but in desperate times people clung to whatever remedies they could find. Illness was isolating, though not in the modern sense. There were no quarantines, no calls for help, only the effort to keep working until the body gave out. When that point was reached, a person lay down and life continued around them. Children and animals were still fed. The sick might be given broth and quiet prayers. Sometimes recovery came, fever subsided, swelling reduced, mobility returned, though perhaps with a limp and a renewed appreciation for warm soup. Other times it didn't, and a candle was lit. Disease was not always the dramatic, corpse-laden horror of mass death. More often, it was a slow, creeping presence, skin darkening, limbs inflamed, deep coughs echoing through homes, afflictions like smallpox, leprosy, dysentery. Even the flu could incapacitate a village. No data was tracked, only word of mouth. A traveller might mention a new cough in a nearby settlement, or the death of children by the river. These whispers mattered. Water was boiled more frequently, herbs placed at thresholds, distance maintained even without instruction. Death was understood, not always feared. Its approach was familiar: slowed breath, cold skin, dull eyes. There were prayers murmured in dim light. When the Black Death struck in the 14th century, it came with ferocity unlike anything before. But sickness was already a constant presence. The idea that one could be fine in the morning and gone by night was not new, just more frequent. The plague returned in brutal waves, grotesque swellings, mind-warping fevers, blackened, bubbling blood. People died in hours or days. Whole communities disappeared. Fields lay fallow as church bells rang often. Some fled, but illness moved faster. Others turned to faith, more prayers, self-punishment, promises of reform. A few lashed out, placing blame on outsiders, on the sinful, on anything but the invisible cause. Spiritual institutions offered explanations, comfort, and burials. Clergy died in large numbers. In some areas, death became too common for rituals. Bodies were buried nameless, en masse. Yet life went on, people adapted. Sickness was treated like cold or hunger, not welcomed but endured with weary determination. Homes were cleaned, herbs exchanged, new prayers spoken. Some believed surviving one illness gave protection against the next. Others simply carried on, milking the cow regardless. Children grew up knowing which plants to avoid, which to chew or boil. They learned to dress wounds, manage fevers, and recognize when hope was lost. But life didn't stop. People married, gathered harvests, shared what food they had. They sat by fires and shared tales, like the one about an elder surviving fever with only garlic water and stubbornness. Plague wasn't an end, it was a constant. For those who endured, survival was defiance, a quiet but fierce belief in another tomorrow. And if that tomorrow didn't come, they trusted someone would remember them, or at least their habit of adding rosemary to soup. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful, but heavy with silence, full of creaks and distant noises, a stillness that made one aware of every sound in their body. Day ended with fading light, and everything needed to be finished before darkness shrank the world. There was no endless candlelight. Wax was precious. A tallow lamp might be used in emergencies or devotion. Most nights, only glowing coals remained. Sleep came in two phases. First, a period of rest after sunset, then a waking interval, followed by a second sleep. And this wasn't unusual. It was how people coped with the extended hours of night. The first sleep would begin not long after darkness fell. Do you like this personality? Settled. The animals grew quiet. Children were silenced. The home, perhaps a single room, maybe two, slipped into stillness. If there was a mattress, it was filled with straw or feathers, often uneven, and typically shared. Without one, people slept on woven rushes or straight on the dirt floor, comforted only by familiarity. Everyone slept in the same space, family, extended kin, even workers, not out of affection, but necessity. It was the warmest part of the dwelling. On especially cold nights, animals were brought in too, a goat by the door, a dog near the fire, chickens in a basket. Warmth outweighed personal space. Privacy didn't exist. Sleeping alone was considered a punishment to luxury. Only the wealthy could afford solitude. Everyone else managed as best they could. People faced the wall, stuffed their ears with straw, shared blankets, and breathed the same air. Someone always snored, and others got used to it. The first stretch of sleep lasted a few hours. Then, predictably, people awoke. It wasn't a disruption, but an accepted rhythm. Around midnight, the world was hushed and still. Some prayed, others tended the fire, visited the chamber pot, or stepped out into the biting air. Some reflected, others whispered. It was also a time of powerful dreams. People believed this midnight period thinned the boundary between the living and the dead, the holy and the everyday. Dreams during this time were vivid and often remembered. They were spoken of the next morning, not as small talk, but as meaningful experiences. Eventually, a second sleep came, deeper, slower. This was the healing rest when pain eased and the day's fatigue began to lift. If it went uninterrupted, you were fortunate. If not, you lay still, waiting for morning. The night never fully quieted. The fire snapped. Wind moved through the roof. A baby cried. A cow shifted. Sometimes coughing broke the quiet, the harsh, lingering kind. Everyone heard it, but no one remarked on it. It was understood. Fear of the dark was grounded in reality. The night held true dangers, wolves whose howls approached the edge of the settlement, real and hungry, not imaginary. There were also bandits, strangers, accidental fires, roofs collapsing under snow, and things harder to explain, ghosts, spirits, witches, demons. People didn't speak of them openly, but they were acknowledged. To ward them off, households practiced rituals, iron placed by the door, signs made above the hearth, blessings whispered over straw beds, protective herbs like rosemary, sage, and rue hung at entrances. Sometimes a string was tied around a child's wrist just in case. Despite precautions, some thought sleep left the soul exposed, wandering while the body rested. People prepared carefully, mirrors were covered, beds faced the fire, feet were kept away from the doorway. The cold was another constant threat. It crept through walls, the roof, door gaps. People didn't have stacks of blankets. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, even kept on boots. The notion of undressing for bed would have seemed ridiculous. Clothes stayed on. Sleeping near others brought both comfort and irritation. Someone always moved, someone always muttered, elbows jabbed, knees bumped. A dog might stir unexpectedly. Still, it was ordinary. Silence wasn't expected. Togetherness was. And in that closeness, there was a strange sense of safety. You could hear a parent breathing, a child twitching, an elder murmuring prayers in sleep. It wasn't calm, but it was deeply human. It was shared. Dreams were taken seriously. A field of grain could symbolize abundance. A snake, sickness, a broken tooth might foretell death. People learned to read these signs or sought out someone who could. Some individuals were known in the village for their insight, unofficially. Religious leaders had their own warnings. Some dreams were believed to come from darker forces. Sleep was seen as a time when temptation might creep in. Prayers were said before bed to ward off troubling thoughts, to keep the soul ready, just in case the night was final. People went to bed and sometimes didn't wake. Illness could strike silently. Fever might rise. Coughs could worsen. By dawn, someone might have slipped away without a sound. This uncertainty gave morning a quiet sense of gratitude. When daylight returned, when the rooster called, when the coals were revived, it meant another night had been survived. People rose slowly. Every movement reminded them of their age, no matter how young. The cold stung. Faces were wiped. Eyes scanned the room. And they counted the ones who stirred. Everyone was accounted for, and those who weren't were checked on. Once it was clear who had made it through the night, the day could begin. Water was collected, bread was made, animals were tended to. If a dream had meaning, it was spoken aloud. The night's memory faded, not lost, just softened and carried forward. Winter brought long nights of sleep. Summer shortened them, but the rhythm stayed the same. First sleep, a waking hour, then second sleep. Life moved without clocks, but not without order. Despite the hardships, there was a kind of steadiness in that pace, something sincere. Comfort wasn't the goal, endurance was. And when rest came, or warmth, or a peaceful night, it was a gift, unasked for, unexpected. Some years brought hunger, others famine. They weren't the same. Hunger had rules. You could ration, stretch, plan. But famine ignored those rules. It came when the crops failed, when there was no more pretending things would improve. Food became more of a thought than a reality. Signs showed early. Spring brought too much or too little rain. Barley grew in scattered patches. Bean flowers browned too soon. Cabbages split. Wheat drooped low, as if already mourning. Everyone noticed. No one said anything, but the looks were there, and mental math began. What's left? What can we save? How little can we eat? The answers were grim. The hardest part came in summer, not winter. That was when choices had to be made, plant seeds or grind them for flour. Gamble on a harvest or feed a child another bowl. Meals got smaller, the stew thinner, bread less frequent. Bowls weren't empty, they just didn't appear as often. No panic, not yet. You told yourself others might help, that stores might stretch. Hope lingered, if little else did. By late summer, pretending was harder. By autumn, it wasn't possible. Animals ate last, if at all. Chickens quieted, goat cries hollowed, dogs followed closely as if knowing their turn was coming. Bread became sacred. A single loaf split 5 ways. Crumbs were treated like treasure. Stew turned to hot water. Pot colours tinted the broth. Weeds, roots, unknown plants. Anything was tried, some safe, some not. Sleep broke in shifts, not from fear, but hunger. Children stopped asking questions. They no longer begged for stories or sweets. They just sat by the fire and learned how to wait. The village fell silent. No arguments, no laughter, only the occasional cough or crackling wood. Famine didn't harden hearts, it quieted them. Sometimes someone brought back something, a rabbit, a bird, bitter acorns. You ate it anyway, grateful for the mere presence of food. The manor gave grain on occasion, but often didn't. The steward's visit stopped. That meant he took nothing but gave nothing either. His absence spoke volumes. The church gave what it could. Bread, after prayers, a coin here or there, but they too were stretched thin. You prayed more, not always with belief, but from habit. Words were light, easier than lifting a hand. Some left the village in search of food, work, or meaning. Some came back, others didn't. You didn't ask. You were too weary. Famine reshaped you. You didn't feel your ribs from outside. They made themselves known from the inside. You moved slower, bruised easier, woke with clenched hands as if still working. Cold dug deeper. Fire became a companion. You spent more time feeding it than cooking on it. You slept near it, guarded it, because heat, at least, was still yours to give. You've consumed every possible morsel, the roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the stale flour. You've simmered bones repeatedly, soaked strips of bark, baked a harsh loaf that cracked your teeth. When even that ran out, you turned to inedible things that, in desperate circumstances, might pass for food. You boiled and salted leucine. Hardly tasty or filling, but at least chewable. Once you caught a rat, you didn't scream, you thanked God, then you hid it, cooked it yourself, kept it secret. You regret the guilt, not the act. Your dreams warp, lavish spreads of roast, bread, and wine that wake you biting your tongue. Endless pots boiling though days have passed without cooking. Visions of animals returning, green shoots piercing snow. Memories of simpler childhood hunger. And sometimes you wake weeping from dreams of satiety. The graveyard's growth was slow at first, then sudden, then overwhelming. You noticed a death when the church bells stayed silent, no hands free to ring it. Graves were shallow, prayers brief, mourning wordless. Everyone grappled with their own hunger. You longed to grieve, but couldn't spare the emotion, holding it tight like everything else. Eventually, the famine eased, not in a day, but gradually. Rain fell and lingered. The earth softened, seeds sprouted, plants rose weak but true. You dared to hope again and set aside the first yield for others, children first, then elders, while you took the smallest portion. You smiled as you served, and when the first good loaf cracked on top, dark below came from the oven, you paused before tasting. You recalled every hungry day, every cunning trick, every lie told to protect someone else. This time you ate slowly, and it nourished you. By the time you could walk beyond hunger, the church had already claimed you. Your name recorded at baptism, your breath blessed with Latin you'd never grasp, your soul woven into a system reaching far past your village. You belong to this church not by choice, but because no other path existed. In the hush of your days, those dim mornings before the hearth glowed, those damp nights when wind shrieked through the shutters, you felt its weight like gravity. It wasn't merely beside you, it shaped, judged, taxed, absolved, and defined all that followed. The church wasn't a building you entered, it was the air you breathed, the road underfoot, the cadence of your year. Its voice would murmur at your grave and whisper of it long before you arrived. The village priest, often the sole literate figure, served not just as confessor, but as calendar, counselor, and oracle. He held secrets of the heavens, tales of saints, explanations for a dying pig or an incoming storm. He strode through the village garbed in blessing and threat. You whispered your sins to him, hoping against disappointment, deliberately avoiding thoughts of his insight. You saw him at every birth, marriage, and death, the only certain rites in a peasant's life. Between them, he spoke for a God you feared more than loved, for love demanded obedience. You were taught. Latin, the masses' tongue, felt like incantation. You stood in church beside your kin, numb with cold, absorbing words foreign to you. You didn't understand as the priest lifted bread, yet believed or strove to, that something unseen occurred, that bread was no longer bread, wine no longer wine, and that murmured words and gestures could stir the divine. You mouthed along when you could, crossed yourself in sync with others, learned the rhythm of holiness as one would learn a well's path without grasping every step, only knowing you needed it. The church commanded your fasting and feasting, carving the year into holy segments. Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't mark March or April, but spoke of after Easter or near St. Michael's. It dictated what to eat, when, and how guilty to feel. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a rich feast that left you dizzy. Fish on Fridays, even far from water. Almond milk for the wealthy, turnips and cold broth for the rest. On saints' days you shared what little you had, on fast days you imagined what you couldn't. Yet even with an empty bowl your plate brimmed with rules. The calendar governed not only prayer but payments. The church claimed its 10th. From your yield, no matter the time of year, grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your land or your body, it had a value. You gave it because it was considered sacred. That's what you were taught. But it wasn't the divine who received it. It was the one who kept the records, the one who nodded without speaking. You watched as your best barley was hauled away to a storage barn larger than your home. You saw neighbors hand over their last oats, while prayers were offered for mercy they had already paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains were late or the frost too soon, nothing changed. What you owed, you still owed. Sometimes they allowed payment in candles or work. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the burden grew so great that even standing straight, you still felt bent by it. But it wasn't only about taking. There was giving too, though rarely in ways you might have asked for. You were given explanations, order, meaning. When your cow died for no reason, you were told which holy figure to appeal to. When your child became ill, you were told it might be a trial, a punishment, or some evil slipping through the cracks in your belief. You received blessings, rituals, were told to light a flame or journey to a sacred place. Sometimes you were handed a fragment of something hallowed, a bit of bone, a tooth, a strip of cloth stained with a martyr's blood. You treated it like gold. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, it was better than having nothing. There was a figure for everything, one for teeth, one for farming, one for disease. You didn't know where they were buried or when they had lived, only what they could heal. Their tales were half memory, half magic, passed down beside fires by those unsure where history ended and fable began. You turned to them when there was nowhere else to turn. You murmured their names as you stirred the pot or worked the soil. You bargained with them, offering bread, fasting, a journey, if they'd just help this once. Sometimes they did, or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again. A journey to a sacred place was a holy task, but also a rare escape. For a short while, you stepped beyond the same patch of land you'd known your whole life. You walked strange roads toward places you'd only heard of. You carried your hopes with you, on your back, in your hands. You slept beneath bushes or in barn corners. You arrived sore and raw, stood before a relic or a statue, and hoped for some shift within. Sometimes it came. You returned not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you were. Even death followed a script shaped by belief. When the end neared, someone was sent to fetch a holy man. He arrived with oils and words. He touched your brow, spoke over your body, tried to guide your spirit to what lay ahead. Loved ones gathered, candles flickered, a bell might toll if someone could manage it. You were buried on sacred earth beside others who had walked the same path. Then came the rituals. More candles, more offerings, hopes that your name would be remembered in sacred chants, because even after death, dues remained. You were told that the soul might not pass directly to peace. It might linger in a place between neither torment nor rest. You could remain there for years, centuries, longer, unless helped. Unless someone prayed, paid, burned enough candles, spoke your name often enough to lift you free. So families gave what they could. The poor gave food. The wealthy gave property. All to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone dreaded, because fear was part of what was given too. This belief explained things no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why children didn't wake, why sickness took the kind and spared the cruel. It said suffering meant something, that obedience would be rewarded. It provided order amid chaos, and that order, even when it weighed you down, brought a kind of peace. Not comfort, always, but peace. You never truly questioned its power. Not seriously. Not aloud. You might grumble about the cost, curse when leaders turned away, but you kept going. You still knelt. You still crossed yourself when the signal rang. Because if it was wrong, if this wasn't true, then the world had no shape at all. And a world without shape was terrifying. Even when a leader drank too much. Even when demands were too high, even when someone came peddling the only path was forward. And when death came, there was hope that bells would toll, candles would be lit, and your name would be remembered enough to mean something. There was hope that the saints were still listening, that your sins had been weighed and forgiven accordingly. Hope that the institution, with all its grandeur, mystery, and decay, would see you through the rest of the journey. One might expect that after enduring so much famine, disease, oppressive taxes, and the crushing weight of authority, ordinary people would have rebelled more often. That centuries of hardship would eventually fracture their world, that one bitter morning something would snap, that they would gather in open fields or crowded markets, wielding tools like weapons, voices raised in defiance. But they didn't. Not often, not for long, and never together. There were rebellions, scattered uprisings like ripples across a pond, bursts of resistance where the burden had grown too heavy, where demands had gone too far. Sometimes a tax collector's home was torched, a steward expelled, a flag raised. But those flames were brief, extinguished swiftly. They ended with gallows in village squares, silences heavier than before. The world remained unchanged. The fields still needed sowing. To understand the rarity of revolt, one must abandon the idea that these people lacked spirit or courage. They didn't. They were enduring something far deeper than momentary crisis. They survived a lifetime of relentless strain. Their existence was hemmed in by necessity. Hope was not abundant, it was rationed. They weren't cowards, they had no room for error. Daily life demanded everything: fixing a roof, warming a pot of soup. Planning rebellion meant not planting crops. One couldn't afford both. The system didn't persist because it was fair or noble. It lasted because it was old. It was embedded in daily routine. There was no need for justification. It simply existed. You owed labor, you owed grain, you paid your due to the priest and the landlord alike. You nodded in passing to the overseer. You were born into these debts, and unless fate favored you, you died with them. Staying inside those lines meant survival. Barely, but survival all the same. Defiance carried too great a risk. There were enforcers, excommunications, laws written by distant rulers who had never heard your name but could still bind you. Punishment wasn't always death. Sometimes it was exile, starvation, or the burden falling on those you left behind. Everyone had heard the cautionary tales: a parent taken, a relative beaten, a cousin vanished for resisting. These were not rallying cries, they were warnings. Besides, uprising didn't always feel possible. Your neighbors weren't strangers. They were your family, your community. You shared land, tools, stories, and burdens. You might marry the daughter of a man you despised. You might grumble about the dues and still attend services. Leaving or destroying the village meant destroying part of yourself. Resisting wasn't always about fighting. Often it was about adapting. Most didn't passively suffer. They found ways to maneuver within the confines. A pig not counted in the records, a hidden stash of grain, a payment made in food instead of money. These were the rebellions they could manage. Their lives weren't ruled by lofty ideals, but by weather and survival. The essential question was never what was fair, but what would keep them fed through winter. Justice was a distant hope they couldn't afford to believe in. Authorities came and went. Rules changed, but the wind still blew, the earth still needed tending, and children still cried. That couldn't be rebelled against. It had to be endured. The spiritual institutions played a powerful role, perhaps even more than armed force. They taught that suffering was sacred, that perseverance was virtue, that the humble would one day be rewarded, even if no one ever said when. Hardship was cast as a path to redemption, obedience as a virtue that would bear fruit not now, but in another life. And when promises of paradise weren't enough, the fear of damnation lingered behind. They endured the rest. Fire, suffering, and gnashing teeth awaited the proud and defiant. But the common folk weren't idle. Their defiance was quieter. They whispered about the overseers, sang mocking songs about the master's quirks, chuckled when the preacher stumbled. At night, they told tales of better times and nobler people. They found pride in the smallest gestures: a shared piece of bread, a pause at just the right moment, a field tended a little differently from what was ordered. Their rebellion lay in surviving against the odds, not by embracing the system, but by bending it just enough to breathe. Sometimes things shifted. A cruel master passed away and was succeeded by a gentler heir. A new cleric forgave what was owed. A great storm reminded those in power that they too could fall. But those changes came from above. The people's role was to endure, to pass down what little they had, to teach their children when to be silent and when to be bold, and they dreamed. Of course they did, perhaps not of open revolt, but of another life. One where their children wouldn't bear the same weight, where no one would come knocking with lists, where their backs wouldn't break before middle age, where sleep came without fear of beasts, soldiers, or the cold. These dreams didn't promise change, but they gave strength to keep going. What's most remarkable isn't how rarely they rose up, but how they preserved their way of life under immense pressure. They kept their songs alive without writing them down. They passed on stories, remembered which herbs healed and which harmed. They taught each other to pray, to welcome life, to honor death. They built a continuity that outlasted rulers and wars, not through force, but through tenacity. When demands were too great, they survived regardless. When faith became a burden, they still lit their candles. When the world closed in, they held each other and waited for the thaw. The land may have been owned by others, but the earth remembered their touch. They didn't shout slogans or stir revolts like later generations, but there was a quiet strength in how they endured. To live through hardship without becoming hardened, this was its own form of rebellion. To bow not from defeat, but with the knowledge you would rise again, that too was resistance. So they endured, without glory, without tributes, through the rhythm of daily labor, through smoke curling from rooftops at dusk, through lullabies whispered beside fading fires. They lived on in the stories told to children who would one day pass them on. History may overlook them, reduce them to footnotes beneath the powerful, but they were the threads that held everything together. No harvests, no monuments, no armies could have existed without them. They didn't overthrow the world, but they outlasted it. And maybe that's a revolution in itself. And they dreamed. Of course they did. Perhaps not of open revolt, but of another life. One where their children wouldn't bear the same weight, where no one would come knocking with lists, where their backs wouldn't break before middle age, where sleep came without fear of beasts, soldiers, or the cold. These dreams didn't promise change, but they gave strength to keep going. What's most remarkable isn't how rarely they rose up, but how they preserved their way of life under immense pressure. They kept their songs alive without writing them down. They passed on stories, remembered which herbs healed and which harmed. They taught each other to pray, to welcome life, to honor death. They built a continuity that outlasted rulers and wars, not through force, but through tenacity. When demands were too great, they survived regardless. When faith became a burden, they still lit their candles. When the world closed in, they held each other and waited for the thaw. The land may have been owned by others, but the earth remembered their touch. They didn't shout slogans or stir revolts like later generations, but there was a quiet strength in how they endured. To live through hardship without becoming hardened, this was its own form of rebellion. To bow not from defeat, but with the knowledge you would rise again, that too was resistance. So they endured, without glory, without tributes, through the rhythm of daily labor, through smoke curling from rooftops at dusk, through lullabies whispered beside fading fires. They lived on in the stories told to children who would one day pass them on. History may overlook them, reduce them to footnotes beneath the powerful, but they were the threads that held everything together. No harvests, no monuments, no armies could have existed without them. They didn't overthrow the world, but they outlasted it. And maybe that's a revolution in itself.